Well, as you'll be able to easily hear, I'm sort of playing hurt today, so I'll try to make sure you can hear me. If for some reason you can't, somebody wave in the back. So I decided what I would talk about today is something that's been very much on my mind recently because I've just finished a book with Cass Sunstein from the law school. The title of which you see on this slide, and I think it fits well into the topic we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to begin and end with quotes from great Chicago economists that aren't always thought of as Chicago economists. Here's Herb Simon, and he offers the following in an encyclopedia entry on behavioral economics. He says the phrase behavioral economics appears to be a pleonasm. Look it up. What non-behavioral economics can we contrast it with? The answer to this question is found in the specific assumptions about human behavior that are made by neoclassical economic theory. And so what assumptions about behavior do behavioral economists make? The first, which stems directly from Simon, is the idea of bounded rationality. So we take as a constraint the information processing capability of individuals, and we say that they can't solve every problem, and we wonder when an economist as smart as Jesse Shapiro, say, spends 2 years figuring out what a rational agent would do on some problem, and then writes that down as a model of what people do, whether that's an apt description of what guys like us that aren't as smart as Jesse might do. The second is bounded willpower. Some of us sometimes do things that we ourselves think are mistakes. We drink too much wine at dinner, or have one too many dessert, or fail to go to the gym as often as we think we should. The third isn't really a problem, just an observation about human nature. We are actually, as a race, a little nicer than economists give us credit for. And finally, the last part of behavioral economics, there's no real behavioral aspect to it, it's just economics. And that is, we're very interested in the role of markets, and in particular, the question that behavioral economists have addressed themselves to more than traditional economists is what happens when you have less than fully rational agents interacting in markets with fully rational agents. And they're kind of two equilibria you could imagine. One is that the markets kind of make the people rational or render them irrelevant or make them disappear. And the other extreme is that the markets cater to those irrationalities and you get even more of it than you might otherwise. I think the mortgage crisis of last summer illustrates a lot of the second kind of behavior, where the people who were borrowing those mortgages often were being bamboozled by unscrupulous mortgage brokers. So what I want to talk about this morning is policy implications. And the approach to public policy that Cass and I have advocated has the funny-sounding term libertarian paternalism. Now, it's been pointed out to us that we've combined two of the least popular words in America. So outside of this room and certain rural counties in Montana, libertarians are thought to be something weirder than anarchists and downright dangerous. And paternalists are held in even lower regard, if that's possible, People think of people like Ralph Nader as paternalists. We want to combine those two things, which seem to be unpopular and contradictory, not a particularly promising topic for a book, one might think. But what we argue is that actually both parts are uncontroversial, or should be, and are not contradictory. So let me define my terms. By libertarian, what I mean is we, in all the things we design, protect the individual's right to choose. And by paternalistic, we mean designing policies that are aimed to improve the welfare of choosers as defined by themselves. So I have no interest in making somebody make a better choice by my standards. I have an interest in helping them make a better choice by their own standards. Now, we think it's possible to achieve both goals. How do we do it? We do it with something we call choice architecture. And that's a phrase that's mostly what I'm going to talk about today. So the first point I want to make is that, in fact, there's really no alternative to doing this. Choice architects, and by that I mean anybody who designs the institutional features in which people make decisions, have to decide something. Just like the person who designed this building, he couldn't design a neutral building. It had to be a real building with doors and hallways and bathrooms, and all the decisions that get made influence the way everything works. Here's a specific example. There's a cafeteria down the hall. Suppose the cafeteria director learns through experimentation that the order in which the food is displayed influences the food that people eat. What use should she make of that information? How should she arrange the food? Well, you could choose an order that you think the participants will think is in their best interest, or you could try to make them fat as possible. You could deliberately cop out by arranging the food at random, or you could make prominent the food that from the suppliers that offer the biggest bribes. So these are all possible alternatives. Our main point, the main point of the book, is you got to pick one of these. So don't fool yourself into thinking that you can be neutral. You got to pick something. Now, some designs are better than others. If you're like most Americans, the stove you have at home looks like the one at the left. And if you're like me, the chance of turning the back burner on by picking one of those knobs is around 50%. It's about, for me, it's about 60%. So I'm slightly better than chance. That's a bad design. The one on the right is one of many good designs one could think of. We're interested in good design rather than bad design. So I was told that I might get pissed on in this lecture, so I decided to show a picture of a urinal. This is a urinal from the Amsterdam airport. Let me give you a blow-up. What they've done is they've etched a fly onto the urinal. Now, it turns out when guys go to the bathroom, they don't pay that much attention. And but if you give them something to aim at, then they aim. And this fly, you can stand there forever. That fly ain't moving. So, believe it or not, this was designed by some economist who claims that this has reduced spillage by 80%. So, what constitutes good designs? I'm going to try to talk about 6 features and of what makes a good design. And the last one is pretty much straight economics, although even that we have some behavioral spins on it. But most of the others come from the study of psychology. This is very much like human factor engineering. So if you devise a cell phone, you'd really like to make it as likely as possible that when you press a button, the thing that you want to happen happens. So you'd rather make a call rather than delete all your email. And so that's what we're going to try to do. So the first issue, and one where we have a lot of data, is defining defaults. So a default option is simply the thing that happens if people don't do anything. And most of the time, when you don't do anything, nothing happens. But for some things, that's not the case. So, for example, some lawnmowers have what's called a dead man switch. So you have to be holding on to it. If you do nothing, which is release it, it stops. Okay, so you have to design a lawnmower one way or another. Does it keep running when you let go, or does it stop when you let go? That's a decision. And that's true of lots of things. Here's an example in an area that Gary knows well, organ donation. One of the many things countries do to determine how many organs get donated is define what the default rules are. In the U.S., we have what's called an opt-in system. If you want to make your organs available if you die, you have to sign some list. In some European countries, they have what's called presumed consent. You're presumed to donate your organs unless you sign some list. Now, if the costs of signing the list are small, then the prediction from economics is that it wouldn't make much difference. Turns out it makes a huge difference. You probably can't see these bars, but this country is Germany, this country is Austria. One cannot reject the hypothesis that they're the same country. But in Germany, 12% of the people agree to donate their organs. In Austria, 100%. And the only difference is the default. Analysis show that changing the default rules increases the number of organs you get by about 3%. This is nothing to say about whether you should or should not have a market for organs, about which Gary may have something to say. About all I'll say about that is that proposal is astonishingly unpopular, and the psychology of why it's so unpopular, I think, is something worth lots of study. Second is give feedback. People learn when they get good feedback. Digital cameras are better on this regard than film cameras. You take a picture, you immediately see the image that you took, and they were improved by adding a fake shutter sound when you click. So if your camera clicks, that's not because anything is happening unless it's an SLR. It's because they've added a noise that tells you you've clicked. Apparently there's some cell phones now for old people that have fake dial tones. So it's the same idea. One of my favorites is there's a kind of pink paint. When you paint a ceiling, it's hard because you're painting white on white and you often miss things. There's a kind of paint that goes on pink and turns white. And that means you don't miss anything. Well, this is what this government tells us about security. We can just ask, weren't we supposed to be doing all of those things at any warning level? It turns out I looked it up. What are they going to tell us if we go to red? It's going to be the same thing plus expect delays. I'm not making that All right, I'm going to skip that one. Expect error. The first time I went to Paris, if you go into the subway, you get these little tickets that look about the size of a movie theater ticket. And they have a magnetic stripe on one side, and you have to insert it in, and it gets spit out the other side. I didn't know whether the stripe should go up or down. So I stuck it in with the stripe up, and that worked. And then for years, I religiously used it using the stripe up. And then I was there with my wife recently, and I was showing some visitor the right way to use the subway, and she started laughing at me. Turns out it doesn't matter which way you put the thing in. So anyway, it works. Now, compare that to the parking garages in Chicago, where you have to put your credit card in to pay. There are 4 ways that you can put it in, only one of which works. And we've all been behind some idiot who can't figure out which way. And some of us have been that idiot. I'm gonna skip these. Drugs is interesting. Think about the optimal way to devise drugs. The best, suppose you could control dosage. The best dosage would be one shot and you're done. But suppose it's a drug you have to take regularly. Then the next best is once a day, taken in the morning, because that's easiest to remember. Every other day is hopeless, right? Humans cannot master every other day. We're hoping someone will devise a program, we've suggested this to Google, that will read emails and detect whether they're angry, and then send you a warning. There's ones that detect foul language, but that's not enough. We need ones that detect rude emails. We thought of this when we got a rude email from our publisher. In London, many pedestrians get run over by buses because they look the wrong way. Here's an example of good choice architecture, where they've instituted a way of controlling the way pedestrians cross streets, that you can see these guys are forced to walk this way, then this way, and then when they're walking this way, they see the oncoming traffic, and then there's also a little look left sign here. Many times when we choose, we don't know what we're choosing, because we don't know what the mappings are from the names of the product to the thing that we're going to get. Like the dipsticks in your car, which one's oil, one's transmission fluid. You know, I'm about 60% on that too. On some cars, the oil is an O and the transmission is a T. Right? That costs about a nickel. Now, when do we worry about this? We don't worry about it with ice cream flavors. We all know what chocolate and vanilla taste like, and if we don't, we can ask for a taste. Mutual funds is much harder. The names don't tell us anything, and we don't know how to translate whatever we're going to get into utility. All right, I'm going to skip that. Here's a specific policy proposal that we advocate in a whole range of environments. And the idea is that providers are required to give you 2 things in a downloadable spreadsheet kind of format. One is all the formulas on which they base their prices, and 2, all the usage you had in the past year. So imagine this for your cell phone. What you could then do is import that file into a private search engine that would say, if you use that stuff, then here's the formula that suits you best. This is a pretty non-intrusive kind of regulation, and we propose it for mortgages, where we think it would have helped a lot, student loans, and a host of other areas, especially Medicare Plan D. I could have given a whole lecture on that. A D would be a really high, generous grade to give the designers of Medicare Part D in terms of choice architecture. Think of the number of choices isn't always bad. There are 2,000 paints in a typical paint store. Imagine they arranged the paints in alphabetical order, right? So you'd have Aztec white followed by azure blue. Right? That wouldn't be very good. Instead, they do things like this. They have websites or paint wheels. Also, I think the names here are completely useless. Like on this store, there's Kansas wheat and Nebraska wheat. I don't know whether there are any farmers who can tell the difference, but maybe Kevin knows. But okay, I'm gonna skip this and just say something about incentives. We're behavioral economists. We believe in prices. One of the places where I think we have to pay a lot of attention is when the answers to these 4 questions differ. These are standard agency problems. The U.S. healthcare system is a good example. The doctor chooses, the patient uses, the insurance company pays, and everybody, including the trial lawyers, profits. So that means that there are some problems. You can add behavioral spins to this. I spent a little time at the INSEAD Business School. When you make a long-distance call there, you're getting a running total in euros for how much money you're spending. So that helps. I was thinking you could have a Stairmaster that the longer you run, the bigger the cookie you're allowed to eat afterwards. So let me just conclude. Here's a quiz. Gary, do you know who this is?
I recognize the face, but I can't quite remember who it goes with.
Okay, so this is a Chicago economist who said the following: "The economist may attempt to ignore psychology, but it is sheer impossibility for him to ignore human nature. If the economist borrows his conception of man from the psychologist, his constructive work may have some chance of remaining purely economic in character. But if he does not, he will not thereby avoid psychology. Rather, he will be forced to make his own, and it will be bad psychology." So, this is John Maurice Clark.
I guess that.
Now, what relation is he to John Bates Clark? Son. The black sheep of the family. So behavioral economics, I define as borrowing good psychology rather than inventing bad psychology. Okay.
Now we'll turn it over to Gary Becker, winner of our Guess Which Clark. This quote is from contest.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not going to have any slides, so I'm going to give an old-fashioned lecture. And I'm going to speak about Chicago economics and why I think it's been the most powerful theory invented to understand human behavior. It's been applied in a remarkably wide variety of cases, and not always successfully, I agree, but it's been very powerful. Now, Jesse said at the beginning what I did or what Beckerian economics does. I don't know about Beckerian economics, but I'll tell you the course of my career as an economist. I've tried to look at behavior that was important, had major consequences for human well-being, but was not easily understood by the traditional tools of economic analysis. Now, there are 2 different directions one can take when one finds such behavior. You can say, well, there's something wrong with the theory, we have to have another theory. Or you can say, how can I use the power of this theory and extend it to incorporate this behavior and yet make it powerful because I'm building on some theory that has a great deal of power, namely rational choice theory, maximization theory, whatever you want to call it. That's what I've tried to do. for good or bad, for successfully or not, in the course of dealing with different questions. Now, what Chicago economics or rational choice, I'm going to use all these things in the same way. It's been a flexible platform that's not been rigid, that has allowed the theory to evolve over time, especially during the past 50 years. I think that's when the theory has made enormous changes to cover much more varied types of behavior. Now, this theory is flexible enough to allow itself to learn from psychology or sociology and other fields. But it also has much to teach these fields. The flexibility and its analytical power, I think, explains why the theory has had such wide applicability to simple questions of supply and demand, to the growth and decline of different religious denominations, to discrimination against minorities. And I'll go on with some other applications later on. Now, the flexibility of the theory has meant that it's not constant. Now, this conference is supposed to be speaking about the evolution of Chicago economics over time. And certainly the basic theory has evolved significantly. We heard a little bit about that in the first session. We'll hear more about it in later sessions. We heard from Dick Thaler, which is part of that. It's quite different than the theory that I was taught when I was a graduate student. What individuals, for example, are assumed to value. What we were taught by great economists was, well, basically, you think of goods as mainly materialistic, and that was the basic thing that was being valued, mainly selfish people looking at materialistic goods. Now, that view has evolved enormously over time. Now, people have prejudices, we recognize. They're altruistic, they're not selfish in many contexts. They worry about equity sometimes, they're envious, their past consumption affects their choices. They get fear when they think about terrorist attacks or about death. They're stimulated from seeing a cake. So if you put a cake in front of them, they may lower their utility, but they may buy the cake nevertheless. There's revulsion at seeing a horror film, or great pleasure at seeing it, and you can go on and on. And I'll give some examples of that extension. But these are all things that people are doing, mainly in this framework of rational choice framework, maximization framework. Not entirely, but mainly. Now, the decision-making process has also been altered and expanded. Now, my favorite framework to filter this process is through household production functions. They don't typically, at least formally, play much of a role in behavioral economics, I think. But the basic types of concepts are there, and I think it offers an excellent framework for incorporating a variety of constraints that affect behavior. A variety of recognitions that we're human beings. We're not the perfect calculators. We don't have perfect information. We make other types of mistakes. Maybe there is some traditional theory that denies that, but I think modern economic theory doesn't deny all these factors. The question is, how do you process them through an analysis that has power to understand behavior? And household production has genetic factors, has education, has cognitive limits in processing information, has different abilities of different people, and other constraints that will vary a lot from individual to individual. So when we talk about household production, we say, or individual production functions that are relevant to their consumer and other choices, we say, well, they may well differ from people to people. Not everybody's not equally good or equally the same in all this. And I think these production functions are on the same level of importance as utility of the values that people are making. But by going through production functions, you have something you can quantify more readily, and it often has been quantified. Okay? So these are my basic foundations of the individual theory. Utility maximization subject to these production function constraints, and then you embed that in some type of group or market or other types of contexts. What are the implications you get out of it? I'll first mention some in a broad way, and then I'll go into specific examples. I would get 3 broad implications. One can stress others. The obvious one is incentives matter. Now, most people would agree to that, whatever type of economist you are. It certainly is a strong implication of rational choice theory. I think it has been brought to its highest level by this theory, and certainly has been emphasized the most by this theory. So you try to get more benefits, and you try to avoid costs. Simple as that. If you have trivial costs, you may engage in some behavior like voting that it has a very weak, virtually zero instrumental value to an individual. And if the cost is little, you'll do it. Make it rain heavily on a day, and many fewer people vote typically. So you just raise the cost modestly, often you see a difference in behavior. Tipping. People tip, even if you're not going to come back to a restaurant. Is that a puzzle for rational choice theory? Not really. It's only a puzzle if you have a very narrow view of rational choice theory, that people are somehow selfish, they don't care about being embarrassed or whatever other factors you bring in. On the other hand, if a restaurant says tip 30% or so, you're going to find a lot fewer people going to that restaurant, and a lot of people aren't going to tip that amount. All right? So they're willing to do it within limits. The behavior is forward-looking. That's very important. The future is murky and imperfect. You'll make a lot of mistakes in what the future is going to be like. But you try to do it because it's so crucial for your current decisions and their consequences for the future. And the third and certainly crucial factor is that the social or environment you embed these things in make a great deal of difference. Market is the most obvious example. I mean, the market will offer us a lot of options or limit our options in various ways, and that's going to have a great effect on outcomes. So for example, most entrepreneurs may have a great prejudice against African Americans. But that doesn't mean these prejudices are going to survive in any important way in a competitive market. And I'll show you some evidence on that a little bit later. The market enormously impacts on what we observe, what's the equilibrium. So you just can't have a theory of individual choice and have a good analysis. And everybody knows that, but it's crucial. Rational choice theory really brought in the concept of equilibrium because the only reason equilibrium makes a great deal of sense is because you have some rational underpinning to people's choices, including corporate choices. Now, another implication that's often neglected, but it's important, is that in some sense, it's rational not to be too rational. I mean, that sounds paradoxical. But if one is pretty close to the optimum, then you know because you're maximizing, things are pretty flat around the optimum. And you can have moderate deviations and still lose very little in the way of utility. So what looks like a big deviation may in fact be a small deviation. I always have given the example of a parent who's giving their child resources, they're altruistic to them. Well, the child can squeeze a little more out of the parent because the parent gives a little more. It doesn't make that much difference to the parent, but it can make a great deal of difference to the child. And this is a very general principle. You can be pushed around and kicked around within moderate limits of what's the true maximum and not fight it very hard because it's not going to cost you that much in terms of utility. All right, so you may be persuaded to buy more of my brand rather than somebody else's brand because, yeah, you're starting, it's kind of indifferent, so I buy a little more of this and less of that. Doesn't make that much difference to my utility, but it does make a big difference to the seller of a particular brand or not. Okay? And that's an important implication that I think. Persuasion, the theory of persuasion, should be an intimate part of the theory of rational choice or theory of utility maximizations. And Jesse and others and Kevin and I and many others are trying to bring that in, precisely those issues. Well, now let me give some examples in more detail. Start out with addiction, cigarettes, drugs, alcohol, people. I'd like to say the most addictive of all commodities of people. You see that. You're married for a long time, your spouse dies. Many people are devastated as if they had severe withdrawal symptoms, and they do have severe withdrawal symptoms. So how does one model that? How does one try to understand this behavior, which was neglected until the last few decades by economists, although it attracted the attention of psychologists and biologists and the like? Well, one way is to say, well, let's try to extend what we know from other goods. So, for example, if the price of gasoline goes down, I buy more gasoline. I'll also buy bigger cars. And so, as long as I have that bigger car, I'm kind of addicted to gasoline because these cars don't get such fuel efficiency. So if the price of gasoline now goes up, I won't make such a quick adjustment. It'll be spread out over time. In essence, you can say we're addicted to gasoline for a while. Well, now think of the stocks. Instead of thinking of the car, think of something like past consumption as the comparable stock. I've smoked cigarettes a lot. Well, I have this stock of past smoking. It's going to influence me now the same way the big car influences my use of gasoline. So if the price of cigarettes goes up, yeah, I'll respond a little now, but it'll take me a while to work down that stock in the same way as it takes me a while to depreciate my big car, so now I buy a smaller car with a higher price of gasoline. Similar phenomena goes on. It's an extension of the theory, and what's the value of that? Now we can build on all that's been learned about how people adjust stock flow adjustments, where we have obvious stocks and apply it to this whole new set of problems, which are habits and addictions. Well, Kevin and I tried to do that. It stimulated a long literature, some of it taking somewhat different approaches, but all recognizing that somehow you have to build such stocks into the analysis to try to understand that kind of phenomena. An example from AIDS. A severe problem for many parts of the world, and certainly a major problem still in the United States, and an even more important problem when it first hit in the 80s. What happened? When the AIDS virus was detected and the consequences of various forms of activity became clear, you found rather big adjustments in terms of greater use of condoms by gays, shutdown of a lot of bathhouses that were frequented by gays, more stable relationships among gays. All this is documented. So you've had a significant response to this terrible cost of various forms of behavior. Well, then we developed the retroviral cocktail drugs that didn't eliminate the problem of becoming HIV positive, but certainly greatly reduced its consequences. And lo and behold, what do you see? People going back, not all the way back to their previous behavior, because you wouldn't predict they would go all the way back, but a significant way back, because the consequence now of bathhouse sexual interactions, less use of condoms, was much less serious. Still much more serious than before the AIDS, HIV virus became prevalent, but much less serious than it was before. A third example. So there you found, and I think the same thing has to do a lot with weight gain. Why? How does one understand weight gain? I think there are two fundamental forces involved. One, the lower price of fast foods, price of time in terms of computers and internet and video games, and forward-looking behavior in the expectation that new drugs are going to come along, and being overweight is going to be much less serious than it was before. And will turn out, I don't know if that's the right interpretation. It's my interpretation. I think it's consistent with what we see among teenagers and the like, and it's accurate. There are going to be new drugs that are going to make it much less severe. So when parents tell their teenagers, don't get so overweight in 30 years, it's going to be bad for you, they're just lying to them. It's not going to be so bad for you. So all of you who like eating a lot, don't worry about it so much. I don't know if that applies to you or not, Dick, but. Another example is terrorism.
I've already stopped away.
Another example is terrorism. Now you look at response to terrorists, let's say in Israel, bus bombings. You find enormous responses to really very low probability events. How do you explain it? Well, on the one hand, you could say, well, people are over-responding to these low probability events. It's kind of not calculating right. And maybe there's some of that. I can't say that that's not there. The other factor you would stress, and this is what I've been doing in a paper I have with Yona Rubinstein, is that terrorists creates a lot of fear. That's the role of terrorism, is to create fear. And the fear they create leads people to be more worried about the potential of an attack than its actual probability. Now, how do you test that? Well, we've tried, so we create a model building on rational choice theory, but extending it in a way to incorporate fear and also to incorporate the fact that you can control this fear through various forms of investment activity. And then we go out and try to test it, and we have actually been testing it with Israeli data. For example, one of the implications of this approach, this investment approach, is, it seems a little bit surprising, is that, say, more frequent users of buses would be less likely to react than the less frequent. You might think the opposite, because they have, in a sense, more to lose. But the data are very strong that the more frequent respond much less. Think of them as more incentive to invest because it's more important to them in trying to control this. The location of people, where they live, the value of housing, shows up very nicely in terms of a fear model. And you can apply that to fear of death. Kevin and Tom Phillipson and I are working on end-of-life expenditures, why people seem to be willing to put so much value on end-of-life expenditures. Simple, usual statistical value of life calculations wouldn't give you that big an incentive to do it. But if you bring in the fear of death, which has been remarked by philosophers for hundreds of years, I think you have a better handle on attacking that problem. Two more examples, and then I'll be finished. One is discrimination. As Jesse mentioned, that was the first problem I really worked on in a serious way. And what I thought I did there is combine two features, and neither one of them alone was sufficient. One, that you just don't want to maintain the assumption that employers or fellow workers are only worried about profits, that at times they're worried about other factors. And let's say, take the employer, may not like hiring women or African Americans or Jews or whatever group it may be, okay? And so they have this prejudice. And the second component is, how does that prejudice work out in the marketplace? So I stressed early on in that study is, yes, this is going to introduce prejudice, but you cannot understand what we observe in the market or in the economy without seeing how it works out in a competitive environment. Okay. So I went through an analysis of that and argued and showed theoretically, didn't have much direct data on this, that the people with the lowest prejudice would tend to have greater weight and more likely to survive. Well, an interesting recent paper by Kerwin Charles and Jonathan Gurian actually got some data on prejudice and had some evidence on something about where the market prejudice is taken from the average or some lower end, as the theory predicts, and found some supporting evidence. There's not a lot of evidence on this, but that was one. Now, my final example, in a sense, I'll deal with a couple of the examples that Dick has raised either today or in the paper and a very interesting, I think, paper that he and Cass have on libertarian paternalism. I do think that's a contradiction in terms, those two words, but it's catchy. I'll admit that much. So you look at a cafeteria, and the cafeteria has a choice of putting food out, let's say a chocolate cake. This is one of the examples you give. Chocolate cake or not. What does it do? Well, and it knows, for example, that if they put the chocolate cake out, people will buy the cake, okay, and they make a profit on that. Do they do it? Well, we have to have two things in order to answer that question. One, why do people eat the cake when they see it? Now, one view is, well, they don't have very well-formed preferences and they get stimulated. Maybe there's something to that, but I don't think it's the right view. I would say the right view is that seeing the cake is part of that affects their utility. That's part of the utility. It not just affects their utility. Sight of things. I see a beggar, I may lower my utility. I see a cake, that stimulates my demand for the cake, but whether that raises or lowers my utility, that you can't tell from that example. Suppose it lowers my utility. It lowers my utility, but I buy more cake. Okay? I'm the cafeteria. I say, gee, yeah, I'm buying this cake, it's lowering his utility. If I want people like him and him to come back again, I'm not going to show that cake, even though I can get him to buy the cake now, because he's not going to want to come in the future. He knows I'm a cafeteria that shows this cake, and he doesn't want to eat that cake because it lowers his utility. Okay? So I would predict you wouldn't see that as long as they're expecting repeat business. Now, if you have a tourist area where people come once and for all, yes, you'll see more of these actions. And then the way the market tries to protect people is have national brands and so on when you know what you're going to get. It's not you go into a cafeteria, you've never heard of them before, and you don't know what they're going to do. So that's how the market both incorporates individual preferences and the market disciplines what is being done. Now, is this an example of paternalism? No, I don't call that paternalism. I call that market economics. I mean, you're not going to, it looks like you're going to make a profit from this, but when you take account of future consequences, you don't make a profit. People are maximizing. I don't see anything paternalistic about it at all. So I think that fits in very nicely. And Jesse keeps looking at me for time and so on, so I'm going to end it. I would like to go into opt-in and opt-out, like the Oregon case. But I'll just say one thing about it, Jesse. You are being very patient, so I'll add one thing about it. Yes, it makes a big difference in the Oregon case whether you offer them the opt-in or opt-out in terms of whether they choose one or the other. And you presented the right type of data. It makes a much smaller difference in actual harvesting of organs. And why? I think the crucial factor in explaining that is, and this is relevant also for a lot of the pension and retirement problems, the reason is that when an individual makes a choice whether opt-in or opt-out, it knows that that choice can be overridden very much by his children or his parents when the actual time comes. And if you look at what's known about different countries that have tried to go and say, you have to opt out, and they get all these people, don't opt out, the children come along and say, I don't want my parents' organ to be used, and almost no country, probably no country, is willing to override the children at that point. So, okay, it doesn't make any difference what you're saying at that point. Now, I'm not saying that's the only story in the opt-in and opt-out analysis, but I think it's a relevant part in terms of trying to get a deeper understanding of that phenomenon. So thank you very much.
So we have relatively little time left, but seeing as how lunch is not as important as human behavior, I thought I might try to ask each of our speakers a question, and then hopefully there'll be a little bit of time and I can open it up to the floor. So first, and I'll try to well, so first I'll ask Dick a question. You talked about using the fact that people are kind of nudgeable to design better public policies. But I'm sort of interested in how that connects with a point that Gary's made in many different ways over the years about public policy, which is that, and you and I have talked about this, that The fact that there's opportunities for good public policy doesn't mean that real public policy will take advantage of those opportunities, as opposed to taking advantage of other opportunities to nudge people to vote for the incumbent or pay more taxes to their local government or what have you. So I guess I'd like to ask, how do we design the incentives of the state? How do we do choice architecture for what state actors can do in the presence of this sort of nudgeability?
Yeah, well, obviously it's a complicated question. Let me, my one-word answer is the same. We have one answer to everything in this book, which is transparency and feedback. So let's take the example of Medicare Plan D. There's a certain group of participants, the so-called dual eligibles, who are available for Medicare and Medicaid. They're forced to enroll in this new prescription drug program, and if they don't, a plan is picked at random, and the government decided that the best way to do that would be to pick a plan for them at random. Now, we make fun of that design in our book and think that it's surely possible to pick a plan better than choosing one at random. We don't think many markets, we don't pick our cars at random. And particularly for drugs, for old people, the drugs you take next year are highly correlated with the drugs you take last year. And so it's pretty easy to predict which plan is best for people. Now, you can say, well, we'd worry that if they did something else, that there would be rent-seeking. And the answer to that is yes. There's also rent-seeking with this. So the state of Maine has instituted something they call intelligent assignment, where they pick plans for people that they can opt out of based on the drugs they used last year. Florida tried to do the same thing, and they were sued. They were sued by a company called WellCare that was benefiting from the random assignment because they were in there offering lousy plans and counting on getting 1/n of the participants and making a lot of money. So, yes, there's going to be rent-seeking, and I think you got to make sure that the public is able to see what's going on. So I'd require all legislators report all donations. I'd make all meetings of regulatory bodies. You'd have to know who's there. If we're going to have a meeting to devise energy policy, we're going to announce who gets invited. And, we behavioralists don't think that everybody's honest.
Thanks, Dick. Let me ask Gary a question about temptation and self-control, which is something that both of you mentioned and something that both of you have worked on. So Dick produced one of the early models of multiple selves, and Gary's work on Beggars and Spouses is in some ways a paper about self-control and about a situation where I might like to constrain my future self by not crossing the street and seeing the beggar, instead staying on this side. But what I'd like to understand better is what kind of test we can do to tell the difference between your chocolate cake example and cocaine, where I think you and Kevin have argued that there may well be a role for at least taxation, maybe not prohibition, but taxation in trying to inhibit people's choices. What kind of tests can we do to figure out essentially how rich or effective the market for self-control is? Because that's really what this is about. If people are sophisticated and know that they're subject to these temptations, how well will market institutions and private institutions be able to help them avoid the situations that are going to let them make bad decisions? And what can we do as applied economists to go and figure out where to draw the line between the limits of the market and the role of the state?
Yeah. What do you want, a 2-minute answer to?
Yes.
At most.
Yeah. No, you're raising an important issue. I mean, temptation and self-control are obviously issues. You might call them one of Dick's things that he mentioned. I forgot the exact
Bounded willpower.
Well,
yeah.
bounded willpower. Now, it depends what one means by bounded willpower. I have an example. I'm a drinker, let's say, and I'm a modest drinker in reality, but but let's say I was a heavier drinker, and I felt that was causing me problems. Okay. Going into a bar, seeing everybody else drinking, stimulates my desire for drinking. Perfectly common sense and right attitude. There's nothing inconsistent with that, with what we talk about, at least in modern economic analysis. Okay, so what do? And you're asking what should the government do as well? Okay. Now, to the extent I know that problem, I'll try not to go into bars. So you find a lot of people just will never go into a bar. They don't drink. They don't want to have liquor in their house. They're reluctant to go to a party where everybody else is drinking. That's the way they try to factor in to their behavior in a forward-looking way their recognition that they have this self-control problem. Now, what does the market do? Well, it depends. If you're in a market where reputation of say, restaurants matters to the restaurant a lot because it affects their repeat business, then to that extent, the market will respond to this individual's preferences because this person won't go to a restaurant where they come up and show them a bottle of wine, say, don't you want some wine or not? They will keep it in the background. One of the examples with the cafeteria in their paper on paternalism. They'll try to keep it in the background. On the other hand, you take drugs, illegal market. There's very little risk in terms of consequences from a drug dealer not trying to tempt you into being a drug user, because you don't have. It's the nature of the illegal market. What the market would look like if it was legal, I think, would be entirely different. But in such a market, yes, I'm a pusher of drugs. I push them on you now. There'll be consequences, maybe, that you'll consume in the future, but you're not going to, it won't affect me much. In fact, it'll be positively affect me. So I'll offer you a low price, a teaser price to get into this, and I'll try to tempt you. Now, how well individuals resist that temptation, that's a good issue. I think most people do resist that temptation, but a certain fraction of people don't resist it. So what should we do? What should the government do in these areas? I'm generally libertarian on these issues. I don't think there's a major role for government in these areas, other than the usual softball things. They should be educating people and giving people more information. It often doesn't make any difference, but yes, I have no objection to doing these kind of things. I'm suspicious of government in doing this. You raised that with your question to Dick, and I have to say it applies to this area as well. I don't think governments get many things right. And I find in my own thinking about supporting various government initiatives, it usually was I overestimated how well governments would do it, and it turned out they did it pretty badly. And so when you start out with that skepticism, can governments get right the issue of the issues you addressed to Dick? I think generally not. Can governments get right the drug issue? I think not, because look what they're doing with the war on drugs. The war on drugs has been a fantastic failure. No other way to describe it. A fantastic failure. And yet we've had the war since Nixon began it in the 70s. 35 years approximately we've had this war. Every single president has supported it enthusiastically. And the evidence is very strong in almost any dimension you want. It's been a fantastic failure that has spread the failure from the United States to Mexico, to Colombia, to now Afghanistan, with no limit. So when you look at that evidence, I say, yes, you want to be a libertarian, forget about the paternalism in most of these cases.
We're a bit over, but let's take one question from the floor. Yes.
Gary, my question is about applying your framework to politics. In the sense that you see people voting against the economic self-interest
What do you mean? I'm not sure what you mean,
For
Kareem.
example, a union member voting for Republican, or at least a perceived self-interest. And my question is, first, why would it do that? And secondly, in the longer term, what would be the factors that would change their voting pattern?
Yeah. Well, I alluded to the voting issue briefly in my remarks. Let me elaborate slightly on that. Voting, there's no connection between voting and self-interest in the sense that what I vote, except when minute probably doesn't make any difference to the outcome, okay? So you got to decouple in any instrumental way how I'm going to vote from outcomes. Now, that doesn't mean people don't vote usually in ways that they think will favor themselves, but not because they're going to have an influence, okay? So it's not difficult to understand why a union member might vote for a Republican or a businessman might vote for a Democrat who's proposing higher taxes on businesses. It doesn't make any difference, and you may be attracted to a particular candidate or not by the nature of what they're proposing. And so, yes, you're going to do that. You like the candidate. It's an expressive type of vote, not an instrumental vote. I think as soon as we get voting away from instrumental and try to understand how people vote in non-instrumental ways, even though most of the time, if you look at the data, most union members do vote for pro-union type of candidates, and most businessmen do vote for pro-business candidates. But you cannot understand that by taking any simple instrumental interpretation. You have to embed that in a model of persuasion, how people get persuaded. They may like to vote for somebody who's saying they're going to support their interests, but they're doing it from a persuasive theory of choice, not from an instrumental theory of choice.
Okay, thanks so much. We're a few minutes over, mostly my fault, so in recompense, lunch is on me. Please join us in the Winter Garden for lunch, and please join me in thanking our panelists.